We also had a very interesting conversation. I'd like for you to recapitulate it a little bit, if you would, please, about the historiographic turn in the 1960s that made this the problem it became in your mind. Tell from the
It's a very interesting story, and it's told by Novick in a book, The Holocaust in American Life. But this is the general outline. You know, when I was growing up in the 50s, we didn't know anything about the Holocaust. I mean, it happened, but no one taught us anything about it. And most people in the Jewish community were sort of ashamed about it. In other words, it wasn't something to brag about, and everybody just wanted to forget it. But at some point in the 1960s and 70s, as a result of the civil rights movement, people kind of rediscovered the Holocaust. And then the '67 war with Israel and its many enemies, American Jews started becoming much more prouder and identifying more with Israel. And so by the 70s, people were much more likely to support Israel, and we're now concerned about, well, what did we do during the Holocaust? And this tied in beautifully with the times where historians were now saying, you know, slavery was horrible, we've got to rewrite the whole history on race relations. And among Jews, it was the same thing. We were rediscovering things that people were either ashamed or weren't interested in or wanted to put in the past and not talk about. And so in the 70s, victimology, and I'm using it in a negative connotation, became a kind of a passion of people. Now, I think some of this was good. When I was growing up, I never knew that, you know, 200,000 black soldiers fought in the Union Army. I mean, we didn't learn that. Well, that was wrong, and that had to be corrected. But it kind of went overboard. In other words, we've become obsessed with the Holocaust. We've become obsessed with America's fault. And so David Wyman wrote a book called Paper Walls, and then he wrote a second book called The Abandonment of the Jews. He's a very good scholar, worked very hard. These books were bestsellers, and essentially they convinced people, and other historians working in the field, Henry Feingold, The Myth of Rescue, and others, that America could have done more. We should have let in the passages on the St. Louis. We should have bombed Auschwitz. So America then gets blamed for not doing enough. And this fed into support of Israel. If we had only stood up, we shouldn't be silent in the face of mass murder, which no one can argue with. And I think this just had a momentum to it. And so the scholarship then changed in the 70s, 80s, 90s. The great majority of people writing now became the political correctness party, in which the American Jews were silent and didn't speak up, which is not true, that Franklin Roosevelt was an anti-Semite, which is absurd, and that we didn't speak up about the Holocaust, which is not true, and that we didn't go bomb the camps and save the Jews, which was a military impossibility, and morally wrong. I mean, you wouldn't want to bomb camps and kill, you know. But all these things took hold on the popular imagination, and it helped raise money. I mean, in the Jewish community, you raise money for Holocaust Museum to teach this lesson, which I agree with. I think these are important lessons, and support of Israel. So it all came together, and so now you have the new version of history in which America somehow we're the bad guys because we didn't stop the Holocaust.
That's a fascinating summary, and David Wyman in particular has really sort of taken you on.
Oh yeah.
And how have you responded to that?
Well, it's really not David Wyman. David Wyman is an older man, and he's more or less retired, but the executive director of something called the Wyman Institute. The Wyman Institute is a pretty low-budget outfit in Washington. They raise money for conferences and publishing books, and they're just in love with this, with David Wyman's interpretation of the thing. So they have a website, which I encourage people to read, certain comic relief, wymaninstitute.org, and every book that comes out on Roosevelt is a bad book. In other words, if you go on, you'll see that my book they excoriated, Conrad Black's book, Richard Brightman has a new book, they criticize the Roosevelt Library. In other words, everyone is wrong and they're right. And so they issued press releases, they sent emails to various places where I was speaking to try to prevent me from speaking. Now, you know, this is something I really don't understand. I mean, if they want to come out and debate me, I've invited them to debate me. In fact, the Roosevelt Library invited them to come and debate me and some other people, and they will never show up. And why that is, I don't know. Because if they're so brilliant and all their theories are correct, they ought to be able to demolish me in a debate. So I'm issuing another challenge now. I'm on YouTube, right?
That's right.
Raphael Madoff, call me. Let's debate.
Very good. We'll host it. We will be happy to host that debate.
He'll never show up.
At the Hauenstein Center for Presidential Studies. Well, this is, I guess this has become such a passionate topic for you, and that's what characterizes Holocaust literature. It is a topic that arouses such burning passion in this.
Really
and that's
does.
why
It
it's
does.
not always who has the better historiography.
Right.
It's who tells the story with the heartstrings, and it's tragic story.
Yeah, right.
But do you think that this topic is particularly difficult to handle because of the emotional content?
I think it is. I think particularly for Jewish people, and particularly Jewish people who are older. In other words, I'm 61, and I would say my generation, maybe even people in their 50s, and certainly the older people, very hard to deal with. And so a lot of people, I've had talks where people have just basically gotten up and walked out. They just cannot listen to it. In other words, America did not bomb the camps. America did not save the passengers on the St. Louis, and therefore what I'm saying is just horrible. And they feel very strongly about it. And but it's not unusual. I mean, in the times we're living in, for example, I gave a talk to a black Jewish group in which I pointed out that there were more black slave owners in Charleston, where I come from, South Carolina, than there were Jewish slave owners. And, you know, the audience goes nuts with the idea that black folks own slaves. And, you know, and if you try to talk to an audience about this, you will get a lot of resistance. And it's a very deeply felt thing. I mean, it just is. And there are a lot of topics like this in American history.
Are you trying to push everybody's buttons?
Yeah, I do.
Exactly.
In fact, I gave a speech one time, and the audience wasn't too happy about it. The guy told me afterwards, he says, if I were you, I wouldn't run for public office.